The letter began with a smudge of dirt across the corner, the paper creased from being folded and refolded 100 times. "Hey Peanut," it read. "I hope you're not giving your mom too hard of a time." The words were handwritten, a rare personal touch in a world dominated by digital memories and holograms. Sergeant Mason Reed had meant every one of them. Even as distant screams echoed through the busted corridors of Outpost Theta 7, he wrote with a steady hand and a soft smile. The ink trembled only when a far-off shockwave rattled the rusted bulkheads. "Things are getting louder out here," he continued. "But you know your old man. Louder means closer, and closer means I get to come home sooner." He sealed the letter with a thumbprint and tucked it inside his vest, right over his heart. The outpost smelled of burnt circuitry and cold sweat. Power flickered. Reinforcements were a dream, medics even rarer. They were the last defense against an enemy that didn't understand surrender, because the humans had never taught them the meaning of it. The outpost was dying, and the soldiers with it. Everyone knew. No one said it. In a distant orbit above the chaos, alien medics aboard the Ark-class vessel Luthanari had just received orders to descend to Theta 7. Their directive was clear: recover bodies, offer triage to any surviving sentience, and observe human battlefield psychology. Most of the crew hadn't even seen a human in real life. They had watched flickers of footage, mud-covered beasts who fought with bone fractures and missing limbs as if pain were a minor inconvenience. Forlack, a senior xenomedical analyst, had seen enough blood to drown stars. But when the doors opened on Theta 7, even he paused. The silence screamed. The trench lines were gutted. Sandbags shredded by kinetic slugs were stained with patterns that looked more like abstract art than gore. Bodies were motionless but arranged unnaturally, almost defiant. One soldier had died sitting upright, staring at the sky with empty sockets and a grin. The team advanced cautiously, scanning for vitals. Nothing but echoes. Then a faint noise cracked the air. Singing. An old Earth melody, ghostly under the static hum. "Almost heaven, West Virginia." The voice wavered. The team pivoted toward the sound, unsure if it was a radio loop or something worse. They reached a collapsed tunnel under which lay one human, barely conscious, legs crushed beneath ferrocrete beams, blood pooling dark and slow. Sergeant Mason Reed. One eye swollen shut, the other gleaming with something terrifying, awareness. "You're late," he rasped, then coughed up something thick and red. "I've been planning my escape. Just need someone to hold the rubble while I crawl out." His lips stretched into a grin that should have been impossible. Bones jutted from his thigh at wrong angles. He'd lost 2 fingers. The biometric scanner read pain levels that would shut down any other species' nervous system. Forlack had to recalibrate 3 times before accepting the results. Reed asked for water. Then a smoke. "Damn rations ran out yesterday," he mumbled. "But don't worry, I still had my letter." He tapped his vest. "Gotta make sure she gets it." The alien team exchanged glances. There was no protocol for this. The man was dying. No anesthetic could dull what he was enduring. He should have been unconscious. Maybe dead. Instead, he was directing them on how best to lift the beam without making his leg worse. One medic asked if he could feel anything. Mason laughed. "Of course I feel it. I just don't care right now." As they cut him free, his screams echoed down the hollow corridors of the outpost, but even then, he kept cracking jokes. "Tell your friends I'm not usually this messy," he gasped. "Next time I'll wear my dress blues." When the evac beam lifted him aboard the Luthanari, the medical team didn't celebrate. They just stared. A being that had suffered catastrophic trauma was joking. Singing. Alive. There was a moment of silence in the med bay as machines whirred and fluids pumped. Forlack scanned the medlog. "Subject's cardiovascular system operating under duress," it read. "Estimated trauma threshold exceeded. Subject remains conscious." In a recorded log, Forlack whispered, "This should not be possible." Mason, barely lucid, turned his head. "Shouldn't be, but is. That's us in a nutshell, Doc." The war had made monsters of men, But humans never really became monsters. They just adapted. They laughed where others would cry. They bled and still moved forward. And above all, they never surrendered, not even to death. Later that night, as Mason drifted in and out of awareness, he clutched a letter to his chest. A young alien technician watched, blinking nervously, unsure if she should speak. Why do you do it?" she finally asked. "Why do your kind fight until there's nothing left?" Mason didn't open his eyes. "Because if we don't, nobody will." The technician didn't understand fully. Not yet. But she would. The galaxy would. They came expecting to treat wounded animals. Instead, they found something else. Something terrifying. Something miraculous. The human soldier didn't just survive. He made them question what it meant to be alive. Inside the sterile confines of the alien metavessel, the mood was quiet but unsettled. Word had already spread across the decks. One of the humans was laughing while his organs failed. The news reached not just the science officers but even the battle-scarred commandants who had once dismissed humans as primitives with excessive aggression and fragile physiology. For the United States military officers listening to the transmitted updates from Earth Command, it was a reminder of what they'd always known but rarely voiced. Humans were not designed to survive war. They simply refused not to. Mason's condition was critical. By every known standard of biology, he should have slipped into a coma within the first 20 minutes. Yet the monitors showed consistent, if battered, vitals. The reports showed increasing spikes of neurochemical activity in the regions of the brain associated with humor, memory, and pain resistance. He was whispering the lyrics of songs from decades past, alternating between chuckles and short, deep breaths as the healing gel spread over exposed muscle. No alien present had ever seen a sentient being in this kind of state remain lucid, let alone remain defiant. Forlack and his team submitted their data to the ARC's medical archives, only to have it flagged and returned. Anomalous input. Recalibrate. But there was nothing wrong with their instruments. The anomaly was Mason himself. The Earth military liaison aboard, Commander Dana Reeves, was eventually summoned to provide clarification. Reeves wasn't surprised. "You think this is rare?" she asked with a cold smirk. "This is Tuesday for us." The disbelief among the aliens was tangible. They had long theorized that humans had advanced through their environment by sheer luck, or because of a genetic anomaly. But the deeper truth was far less convenient. Humans weren't anomalies, they were deliberate. Their endurance wasn't accidental, it was cultural. 100,000 years of facing extinction, of famine and fire, of storm and steel, had written this endurance into their emotional code. Pain wasn't simply something to endure, it was something to understand, to dance with, to sometimes laugh at. While Mason drifted in a haze of sedatives and sheer willpower, the alien team began reviewing past combat records involving humans. Patterns emerged. Repeated cases of soldiers continuing missions with multiple broken bones. First responders carrying out evacuations with third-degree burns. Mothers lifting vehicles to save children. It was no longer a mystery, it was a profile. Humans didn't break the laws of biology. They ignored the limits of comfort. They rewrote the boundaries of acceptable suffering. This wasn't about bravado. It wasn't about heroism in the poetic sense. It was about responsibility. In the human psyche, someone always needed to carry the weight. Mason hadn't been laughing because he was brave, he was laughing because someone, somewhere, needed him to. If he didn't make light of it, the horror would win. And in the silence that followed wars, it was those little choices that decided what kind of world rose from the rubble. The alien cultures watching this unfold began internal discussions. Some debated whether the human pain threshold was the result of uncontrolled mutation. Others believed it was neurological miswiring, a glitch that paradoxically created resilience. But a small faction, mostly younger scientists, began proposing something more revolutionary. Maybe this wasn't dysfunction. Maybe it was evolution. Maybe humanity had simply outrun fear. Forlack submitted a classified report to his Homeworlds Council, describing the scene he had witnessed. It did not paint humans as monsters. It painted them as deeply flawed, terrifyingly driven survivors. He included a line that would later be quoted in academic papers across 3-star systems. To watch a human suffer is to watch meaning be forged in real time. Pain does not silence them. It defines them. On the surface, some questioned why humans were the way they were. Why risk so much for each other? Why make jokes in the face of agony? Why carry letters to their children in their last minutes? These were not war tactics. They were acts of desperate love. Of memory. Of hope clung to with fingernails and torn fists. It was what separated them. Not their strength. Not their firepower. But their ability to suffer and still remain human. Back in Earth orbit, media channels picked up the transmission logs. Mason's daughter, just 7 years old, saw a short clip of him laughing through his broken jaw. "That's my daddy," she whispered, holding the screen. "He's being brave." She didn't understand the full weight of it. Not yet. But she smiled through tears. And that was the point. Because Mason wasn't trying to be a legend. He wasn't trying to prove anything to the galaxy. He was trying to go home. That's what none of the reports captured. The courage wasn't abstract. It wasn't for medals or headlines. It was for birthdays missed. It was for the sound of his daughter's laughter. For one more swing set push. One more dandelion wish. One more. "Good night, Peanut." The alien medics would come to understand this, slowly. Through case studies. Through personal stories. Through the way every injured human clung not to rage, but to memory. To relationships. To moments that mattered. They healed differently because they hurt differently. Not because their bodies were stronger, but because their hearts wouldn't give up. This was the essence of the new directive issued across the Ark fleet. Engage human wounded with extreme empathy. They will resist help. They will laugh through trauma. They will pretend they're fine. Do not let that fool you. Treat the heart, not just the injury. The galaxy would never see humanity the same again. Not because of technology. Not because of conquest. But because one broken soldier taught a room full of beings that there is a pain greater than death, being forgotten, and a force stronger than agony, purpose. The aftermath of the incident spread like a wildfire across the communication arrays of several Allied fleets. Logs, transcripts, and bioscans were shared between research vessels, command outposts, and even distant observation stations. Mason's defiance of physiology became the cornerstone of interspecies medical and psychological debates. What was once dismissed as chaotic human recklessness now demanded a second look. From a purely clinical standpoint, his case represented an impossible combination of endurance, awareness, and emotional clarity under extreme trauma. Yet what baffled the researchers more was not just the data, it was the implications. Human emotional structures had always been a point of academic curiosity. Now they were a point of strategic interest. The psychological analysis of Mason's behavior pointed to a resilience rooted in cultural narrative. Unlike most species that prioritize detachment in war, humans absorbed the cost of pain as part of their identity. They did not merely suffer, they contextualized their suffering. They used humor, memories, and even sarcasm to assert control over situations that should have rendered them helpless. For the first time, this wasn't seen as a malfunction. It was interpreted as an emotional tactic, possibly even a biological adaptation. Commanders of non-human species began quietly reassessing previous battles against humans. Moments once attributed to tactical luck or adrenaline now carried new meaning. Soldiers had continued despite collapsed lungs. Pilots had completed missions with shattered limbs. Medics had prioritized comrades over their own lives, bleeding out beside those they just stabilized. These were not statistical outliers. They were a consistent thread, evidence of a mindset that defied standard expectations of biological beings in combat. The horror of it lay not in the pain itself, but in the human response to it. When confronted with devastation, they didn't fracture. They focused. They didn't recoil from suffering, they embraced it as proof of purpose. Alien strategists struggled to formulate protocols for such behavior. How do you account for an enemy that becomes more determined the more you hurt them? How do you counter a force that seems to draw strength from sorrow? Attempts to simulate human psychology in artificial combat scenarios failed repeatedly. Non-human volunteers, placed in similar stress chambers, deteriorated quickly. Their emotional frameworks collapsed. The sense of isolation, dread, and agony overwhelmed them. Meanwhile, archived footage of humans in identical simulations showed them cracking jokes, humming songs, reciting poetry, or whispering messages to loved ones. Some even apologized to their opponents for the inconvenience of battle. Analysts coined a new term in their briefings: the Mason paradox, the idea that a species could exhibit maximum emotional sensitivity while simultaneously demonstrating maximum emotional endurance. This paradox extended beyond the battlefield. In prisoner exchanges, humans comforted their captors. In evacuation missions, they stayed behind to help strangers. They didn't operate on risk-to-reward logic. They acted on a deeply held conviction that no one should be alone in fear. This fundamental belief wasn't codified in military training manuals. It was inherited, taught through stories, shared over generations, passed in bedtime tales and morning headlines. The United States military philosophy wasn't just about strength or firepower. It was about sacrifice as a default state, not an exception. Alien medics, intrigued by this dynamic, interviewed recovered human soldiers in field hospitals. What emerged was not bravado or detachment, but raw humanity. They spoke of family, duty, and the importance of staying conscious so they could make others feel less afraid. Some said the pain kept them grounded, reminded them that they were still needed. The horror of dying wasn't in the act itself, but in the idea of not finishing what they'd started. Not returning home. Not saying goodbye. This deeper insight had ripple effects. Training modules across Allied fleets began incorporating emotional endurance training, not to mimic humans, but to understand how emotional investment could fuel physical resilience. It became clear that human strength did not lie in superior weapons or faster reflexes. It lay in emotional depth, in a refusal to surrender their sense of identity even in the face of suffering. Diplomatically, the United States found itself in a unique position. Mason's case gave Earth a moral leverage it never sought. No longer were humans viewed solely as aggressive or unpredictable. They were recognized as beings capable of absorbing terror and transforming it into courage. This changed negotiations, shifted alliances. Leaders of distant colonies requested human presence not as warriors, but as emotional anchors during crises. Human medics and engineers were embedded in alien relief missions. Not for their tools, but for their presence. Their ability to say, "We've been through worse. You'll survive this." The horror of war didn't diminish with this new understanding, it deepened. Because now other species saw the true cost of what humans endured. The scars weren't just physical. They were embedded in their voices, their stories, their quiet moments. In one recorded post-mission debrief, a sergeant spoke with tears in her eyes, saying, "We carry each other in pieces. Sometimes all you have left is the sound of someone else breathing next to you." These words, translated across languages and cultures, became a reference point for how others began to see humanity. Not as a species of warriors, but as a civilization of guardians. Capable of navigating horror not because they were immune to it, but because they understood it intimately. As research into trauma response expanded, so did admiration. No one sought to become human, but they did start asking how humans became this. What stories had shaped them? What grief had carved out that room in their chest where strength now lived? Mason was still healing, his body a map of what should have been fatal. But even as he slept, his example rewrote perceptions. He didn't need medals or speeches. He had already changed something far more permanent than policy. He had shifted belief. He reminded the galaxy that pain isn't always the end. Sometimes, it's just the beginning of something unforgettable. Rumors of the incident reached factions previously disengaged from human affairs. Mason's recovery, his defiance of death, and the echo it left in the minds of alien observers sparked more than just military interest. It provoked philosophical, political, and existential evaluations across various systems. Leaders of advanced civilizations began requesting psychological briefings not just on Earth's military, but on the culture that could produce someone like Mason. The fascination wasn't tactical. It was personal. What kind of species didn't just survive trauma but appeared to grow stronger through it? Several species known for emotional detachment initiated contact with human diplomats, not to discuss peace treaties or trade but to understand grief, endurance, and why humans smiled while bleeding. One particularly advanced civilization, infamous for their emotionally suppressed society, admitted that Mason's footage unsettled their population. Their news networks aired his injury followed by his laughter, causing mass introspection. Religious leaders debated whether this was a new form of madness or a higher understanding of mortality. The consensus shifted toward reverence rather than judgment. Human cultural exports, once limited to entertainment and cuisine, saw a massive uptick. Not because they were exotic, but because other species wanted to study the emotional infrastructure behind Earth's storytelling. Documentaries about wartime friendships, medical dramas depicting human hospitals, and even comedic shows involving daily struggle became critical academic resources. Galactic institutions began integrating these materials into training modules, hoping exposure to human emotional processes could help their own people manage fear and loss with greater grace. Governments that had once considered humanity volatile began reevaluating their stance. They now saw a civilization that did not retreat in the face of horror but confronted it, internalized it, and emerged with a deeper understanding of life's fragility. Strategic alliances shifted. Fleets that previously viewed humans as unpredictable assets started requesting human leadership in critical rescue or negotiation missions. Not because humans were invincible, but because they could walk into catastrophe and remain emotionally intact, often bringing others with them. Mason himself became a symbol, not of strength, but of reflection. A living testament to the human ability to absorb unimaginable pain and still center others. Alien behavioral analysts attempted to interview Mason, but he reportedly deflected the attention with dry wit, focusing more on the comrades he lost than the injury he survived. This, more than anything, cemented the idea that human resilience wasn't about ego, it was about connection. He didn't see himself as exceptional. He saw himself as part of a chain. And chains, by their nature, are only as strong as their weakest link. His strength was for others. This cultural contagion led to a surprising outcome. Alien societies known for isolation began requesting Earth counselors for mental health integration. On battlefronts plagued by psychological trauma, human empathy became as valuable as ammunition. Emotional logistics, a field previously overlooked, was now a primary pillar of interspecies cooperation. Human-led training modules on compassion under pressure were introduced into interstellar academies. Trainees were taught not just how to aim a weapon, but how to hold a hand when someone was dying. Religious groups across several planets began quoting human philosophers and writers. Not because they adopted Earth's spiritual systems, but because they resonated with the emotional courage found in lines like, "We go on not because we must, but because others need us to." Memorials for fallen soldiers, once species exclusive, began including universal dedications, inspired by Earth's practice of honoring the unknown soldier. Unity through mourning became a shared practice. Ironically, some of the most brutal military leaders found themselves disarmed, not by Earth's weapons, but by its mercy. They couldn't understand how Mason forgave those who injured him. How he joked about it. How he wanted to return not to retaliate but to continue serving. They realized that to break human resolve, you would have to erase their capacity to love. And that, according to several xenopsychologists, was categorically impossible. This realization shifted conflict philosophy. Wars involving humans decreased. Not because humans avoided them, but because their reputation as emotionally indestructible made preemptive strikes seem futile. Why start a war with a species that doesn't just survive loss, but reshapes it into unity? Medical research also took a turn. Rather than focusing on suppressing pain, alien researchers began studying how humans endured it. Not pharmacologically, but socially. The idea that verbal encouragement, hand pressure, shared memories, and even dark humor could increase survival rates became a new medical doctrine. Hospitals adapted communal healing practices, allowing patients to speak with one another, to share their struggles rather than endure them in silence. Suicide rates in several species dropped after adopting these emotional care models inspired by Earth. All of this stemmed from one impossible event, one human who refused to collapse when everything in his body told him to. One soldier who bled and laughed, who didn't just challenge physics but rewrote how societies understood courage. Mason's injury had become more than a memory. It was now an inflection point in galactic history. Not for its violence, but for its humanity. New literature emerged, penned by alien writers attempting to process what they had witnessed. Mason appeared in poems, speeches, even lullabies. Not as a war hero, but as a representation of enduring love, of shared strength, of the quiet power in choosing to stay, to fight, not for victory, but for one more minute with those you protect. He remained unaware of the vast philosophical shift trailing his footsteps. To him, he was just doing his duty. Healing. Preparing to go back. He hadn't seen the millions who now watched his story to find comfort. He didn't know that entire civilizations were reevaluating their views on pain, fear, and companionship because of him. And perhaps that was the most human thing of all, not realizing that while enduring your own private hell, you've become someone's beacon in the dark. They buried the letter with him. Not because he was dead, Mason lived, stubbornly so, but because that first torn, bloodied uniform with the handwritten note folded into its inner pocket became something sacred. When Mason finally left the field, not by choice but due to orders, the uniform stayed behind. Encased in a memorial on a coalition world where soldiers of multiple species had fallen. The note he wrote while bleeding out, the one thanking his medics and apologizing for the trouble, was displayed in full view. The translated versions surrounded it, each language expressing the same simple sentiment. If this is where it ends, I'm glad I was with you. It became a litmus test for leadership. Recruits in alien academies were asked what those words meant. Some thought it signaled resignation. Others saw it as a final act of emotional generosity. But to those who understood humanity, it was a signal of values that could not be extinguished even by extreme pain. They understood it was never about death. It was about presence. About choosing dignity when no one would have blamed surrender. Mason's continued service, albeit in a quieter capacity, became a catalyst for reforms. No longer fit for combat by regulation, not by capability, he trained medics, focused on trauma management, and led field simulations with a focus on resilience. He was less interested in tactics than in mindset. He told new recruits that surviving wasn't the goal. Staying connected was. If you could keep the person next to you from feeling alone, that was a victory. This philosophy trickled upward. Alien governments began to reconsider how they framed military service. The concept of warrior priests emerged, soldiers trained not just in combat but in compassion. Their job was not only to fight but to keep morale alive in the field. And Mason's teaching was part of their curriculum. Not because he asked to be studied, but because everyone wanted to understand how a man whose flesh had been torn apart could still find the words to thank someone else. His influence reached civilian sectors, too. Entire campaigns for mental health awareness borrowed from the simplicity of his message. Counseling centers printed his letter on their walls. The idea that someone could face probable death and still think about others reshaped how compassion was taught. Even among species that previously considered emotions a liability, the example set by Mason revealed otherwise. Emotions were not weaknesses. They were reinforcements. The ability to care under pressure made warriors last longer, not fall faster. In the broader galactic narrative, humanity's reputation changed. No longer were they just the unpredictable, stubborn newcomers. They were now seen as custodians of a deeper strength, a form of spiritual endurance that no strategy could simulate. Aliens came to understand that the power of Earth didn't lie in its weapons or technology. It lay in the bonds its people formed under fire. In their ability to weep without shame, to forgive without weakness, and to rise with scars they never tried to hide. The footage of Mason's injury, once circulated for strategic assessment, found its way into cultural preservation vaults. It wasn't shown to invoke horror or pity, but reverence. Children on alien worlds watched it in their history classes, not to learn about war, but to understand resilience. When they asked why he laughed, their teachers explained it wasn't mockery. It was the last defense of a man who refused to be broken. A signal to his allies that he was still himself. A human trait that, over time, began influencing naming ceremonies, rites of passage, and leadership oaths across different species. One of the most striking transformations happened on a planet that had once denied emotional expression as a social norm. Inspired by Mason's legacy, their governing council approved the construction of a public monument, not of him as a soldier, but as a patient. Sitting upright, hand raised in a gesture of thanks, face marked with blood and a crooked smile. The inscription below was simple. Still here. And Mason was. He never claimed to be extraordinary. When asked about the legacy he inadvertently created, he always deflected. He credited his medics, his teammates, his parents, his dog even. But the truth no one could deny was that in a moment of ultimate vulnerability, he embodied what it meant to be human, and not just to humans. His last recorded interview ended with a message that would echo far beyond his time. If I laughed, it wasn't because I was fearless. I was terrified. But fear doesn't cancel out love. If you can hold both in your hands, even for a second, you're stronger than anything trying to hurt you. That line appeared in books, in hymns, in marriage vows. And when future generations face their own terrors, whether in war or personal trial, they returned to those words. It became a mantra for endurance, for dignity, for remembering that even when flesh fails, the spirit does not have to follow. His impact wasn't in the war records or commendations. It was in the quiet way people carried themselves afterward. Medics worked with a little more gentleness. Leaders spoke with a little more understanding. And civilians, even those far from any battlefield, found courage in the knowledge that one man had looked death in the face, smiled, and gave thanks. This story, his story, outlasted him. Not because of the drama, but because of the humanity. In a galaxy obsessed with power and survival, Mason reminded them all that the real battle was never against an enemy. It was always about holding on to each other, when it's hardest, when it hurts, and when it would be easier to let go. His laughter didn't just echo through a battlefield. It became part of the galaxy's heartbeat.